Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be coming back to Pensacola. When I was here first, about 30 years ago, we had to drive many miles to find a decent place to eat. Not speaking about the looks. And now, 30 years later, it has become a real place. And you don't know how this happened is really extraordinary. Because I used to be a terribly spoiled child growing up in Luxembourg, which had been destroyed by a war, and in an intact city which had survived the Rundstedt offensive. And where within 30 kilometers there was a forest where over 100,000 GIs had been killed within a fortnight. And I was born like 6 months later. And so it was that kind of massacre and unbelievable destruction which, in a way, gave us 60 years or 70 years of peace, but very bad architecture. Blissfully, Luxembourg was reconstructed by very conservative architects who had not yet caught up with modernism. They were a bit behind, but in a way, it went very well. And some of the historic places, what people think are historic places in Luxembourg, are in fact originated between 1945 and 1955. People think it's historic. But we don't make that distinction, actually. For new urbanism, traditional architecture is not an architecture of the past, but of our condition, which is permanent. And the question, which is so interesting here, the Institute, when I sent a brief to Ken, and he said, concentrate, don't talk about fossil fuels, concentrate on the human scale, because that's clearly what is interesting architecture and town planning. What is the scale to which we should build despite our machine equipments? Because it was really the basis for the loss of scale, of human scale in cities, is that the machine, and if you look at the theoreticians, the writers of modernism, the main motivation was because we have machines, we have to really rethink the scale, not only of our equipment, but of our cities, of our life, and everything has to be dictated according to that machine scale. Whereas our theory is that whatever machines and whatever fuel and whatever energy source we use, we should really know what is human scale, what is the correct dimensionally and from character and from expression. And I'm going to talk about that. It's a rather refined subject which is, goes beyond the first lesson about urbanism and architecture. But one of the problems is that one has always to give the first lesson, because architecture has been so ignored by general education that one has always to come back to the foundational principles. Now we live in a world where there's a lot of conventions, but most of them have been lost in architecture. That technology or technological development is actually tradition-bound, and there's no revolutions in technology. You go on, you try, you test, and then you return, and there's a constant reference to to experience, which is always past. But I think the mythology of progress has particularly been damaging in architecture. But this started a fairly long time ago. Now, for instance, this building, you look at this building, you think it's a monastery with a cathedral, kind of ecclesiastical style, yet it's a house for a very rich man in mid of England, designed by a very talented architect, James Wyatt. That is not a mosque, but it is a technical building for technical equipment, for pumping house, for bringing water to the fountains of Sanssouci in Potsdam, designed by a great architect, Ludwig Persius. And then the reaction against this excess, which was generalized already in the 19th century. Now, what should mosques look like if you build technical buildings like that? Or what should churches look like if that is a house? No? And the living room was exactly under the tower. So there was this extraordinary excess going on, where just a residential apartment building in Geneva would display the entire history of form, of architectural form, on a simple residential building. Now imagine you build entire towns, churches, stables, everything is high architecture, high-tuned architecture. Then against this kind of excess, there was an extreme reaction around the First World War, just after the First World War. And this is not speaking of lack of talent. These are, I only show images of the most talented architects of the period. That was a competition won by a man called Ivar Benson, who is now forgotten, but he was a very great talent, proposing this new square in Copenhagen, where this is an office block, these are residential buildings, and this is the opera house. The same facade already. This was before modernism became really a large movement, but it was really preparing. It was this extreme reaction against the excess of form and decoration, which led to a modernism which finally, you would never guess, but this was a great architect called Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, was the most important German architect who emigrated in 1938 because Hitler didn't offer him the good jobs. No? He emigrated to the United States and designed the campus for Illinois Institute of Technology, and this was the church. Yeah. So what should warehouses look like if churches look that way? And that was, of course, all know the Pompidou Center in Paris, which was actually brought in by a president who is now called Pompidou Center. It was brought in by Pompidou, who was a general of, an assistant of de Gaulle, right-wing party, conservative party, but who brought in this incredible revolution of so-called revolution in architecture, which changed France. And so the question is again, what should oil refineries or technical buildings who process things without humans look like if that is a culture palace? Which still today is the model in France for culture buildings. So that is the confusion into which I was born and grew up that way. But I had as an experience growing up in this beautiful city of Luxembourg, which worked perfectly. There were no slums, and it was a completely traditional city. And it was a small capital of society, in a town of 70,000 people, which had very grand buildings, fantastic landscape. Everything was perfect. There was no reason to make a revolution. Yet I became a revolutionary. I read Le Corbusier, and I made projects where Luxembourg would be cut up in, by gigantic buildings plowing through the hillsides and so on. But then I had my second thoughts, and I began to see who could actually do something for Luxembourg which would not demolish it. And most architects were not prepared for caring after traditional cities. So I brewed up my own theory, and it became actually very popular in the United States, not in Luxembourg or in France. And one of the, I think, the most striking effort to go from the idea that traditional architecture is not something historic, because it's, when I went to university very briefly, it was still taught, but as a history subject. This is what we did in the past, and now you have to forget all that, and modernism is something completely different. Whereas to understand that traditional architecture and urbanism are technology of building according to human scale with natural, mostly local materials, in such a way that the building process and the product are agreeable to humans, and are not just the product of alienated work or a scale which has lost all sense of humanity. So what is the most important discovery is that architecture is an inventory of forms which are either of public or private use, and that the palace or the hangar or the house or the church or the campanile, the temple, the factory, the cooling tower, telephone box, whatever, even the gas station, is a typology of buildings which are relatively permanent, because as societies we either isolate individuals or we meet as communities, or we perform actions which are productive or to do with consumption or education. Those scales have not really changed. I think which are properly human. The defining phenomenon in traditional architecture was that you build according to climate, soil, altitude, and that produced an enormous variety of vernaculars around the world. And that actually what unites is not often the region, but the altitude. You find similar buildings in Himalaya or in the Basque Mountains, Basque Country Mountains, or in the Alps, whereas the buildings in the plains at the foothills of these territories are often very similar, whether they are 1,000 or 10,000 kilometers apart. So that's really the defining fact is climate, altitude, and soil. And it is exactly these material conditions which also define agriculture, or generally behavior, and even in some measure language. Now, it is only the processing of building materials by fossil fuel energies, coal and then petroleum, which allow to create synthetic materials which allow to build forms and uses, internal spaces, which were conditioned in such a way that you could ignore completely the soil, the vegetation, the altitude, and the climate. So if that is possible, our principle is whatever is possible, we should always have these parameters, because they are the parameters which will be as long with mankind as it will exist, whereas the energies sources will change radically as they have changed over the last millennia. So the idea of architectural tuning is really a complement to an instrument which Anders Duany, he's probably the principal theoretician of new urbanism, has elaborated, which is called the urban transect, which defines building typology and even massing according to you analyze collective building collectively and categorizing it from the rural to the very urban, to center urban. You can analyze any territory in any country and you find these categories. It's a practical instrument to classify settlement and then reorder it, find an order which is appropriate for the geography, for the existing networking, and for the climate. Architectural tuning was an essay I wrote for the Prince of Wales for publications of his institute, how far this new form of typological reading of the territory could be linked to an architectural language, to architectural expression, and to architectural values. It's a rather refined subject, but I think it concerns everyone, because it's finally that which decides how cities are going to grow and mature. I've been working on the Prince of Wales's main town planning project, which is called Poundbury in Dorset, and which has now been building for 25 years. We build about 50% of it, this area. And how, over many, many years, how you can have an instrument which everyone who is involved can adopt and behave according to it without being enforced by police and by census regulations, because we have already too many of those. In order to understand the term of tuning, it comes from musical instruments, from dosage also, but that in order to tune, you need already an instrument. Meaning you need a form which makes sense and capable of making music. And it is that instrument, by tuning fork, which allows you to really make the instrument sing and create harmonious sound. Now, in order to understand this, what that means, when you look at a tuner, he generally overstretches the string and then comes down to the actually tempered tune. I do that with my students. They have to take an object, whether it's a vase, a person, a car, or a column, and then they have to modify it dimensionally by changing the diameter, in this case the diameter, or the vertical dimensions. And so you get exactly the same composition, the same sequence of forms, the same, whether it's a flat plate or a torus or a column shaft, and it's by changing, modulating these different dimensions that you completely change the expression. It goes from the, let's say, the classical, and that is really, once you try these extremes, you begin to understand what does it mean a classical form. It's that which rests, which is correct, whereas you can apply all sorts of terms to this kind of, club-footed or and so on. So it's by changing the dimensions that you actually change character. You go from the male to the female, or from the sublime to the grotesque, and so on. You can also completely recompose it and become atectonic. I mean, you use exactly the same elements. And this is generally the condition when you try classicism nowadays with an industry which don't understand the terms, nor the forms, nor the logic, that you end up by doing buildings which are composed this way. And because there's general ignorance of these fineries, very people are prepared to buy a house which is full of these mistakes. We ended up by making a book, Get Your House Right, showing how it's done properly. And that there is, I mean, this makes it easier to understand, of course. Now, in architecture, the terms of vernacular and classical are well used and well understood. Vernacular building is generally to do with building forms which are technical, using materials which can be carried by one or two persons or very few machines in the traditional sense, and tools, and build forms which are stable, which form either a wall or a column or pier and so on. There is no expression other than the purpose to which it is meant, to make a door, a wall, or a room, but without any expression, without character, really. Character comes through intent. Whereas classical architecture, which, and this is independent of cultures, whether you go to China or to pre-Columbian South America, you have the same phenomena, that architecture, classical architecture, is using exactly these same elements, of which there are many more than I draw here, but as a principle, and make them into artistic statements which have to do with giving them character. No, this clearly cannot be a doghouse, or a permanence, and above all a beauty which is beyond the simple beauty of fitting a proper wall, or no. There is an art. It is an art form, and classicism is about an art of building. It's not about an art of expressing something about your mother or your love. It's about the art of giving expression to building elements. So it's a language of building, an artistic language of building. Now, and this ends up by having a vernacular culture and a monumental culture, a culture for public buildings and a culture for private buildings, a culture for the collective or the individual. Now, in this instrument, I introduced that distinction also in town planning. When you look at, generally when people look at a city plan, which has grown over many, many centuries, they say this is medieval planning. No, it's not straight. Whereas this would be considered as Euclidean geometry. This is more natural geometry, Euclidean geometry, classical geometry. Classicism is very much associated with that. And vernacular would be this free when you have hillside towns and so on. But this has nothing to do with Middle Ages. Whatever we do, if you walk through landscape and you walk along, you create a track, and there are many, many people walking along that track, over years, avoiding puddles and trees and growth and so on, it will eventually always be that way. A straight line never comes about by simple use. It is an artistic intent. It is an intellectual intent. It is to do with artistic or intellectual culture. It's not natural. This doesn't exist in nature. Whereas this is natural, you find it in mud puddles which dry, and they form these interesting blocks of dried mud or of dried or of ice breaking up and so on. So it's very close to nature, to natural nature. This is artificial nature, second nature, created by man. Now, often classicism is associated with this, but I think it's a mistake. It's actually a historiographic mistake. Whereas the most interesting classical compositions are really those which mix vernacular and classical in a very elaborate way, very sophisticated way. Now, this very simple illustration of this monastery in Venice, where you have classical architecture for the church and then vernacular for the residential wing. And it is actually these two languages, one purely of construction and one of artistic expression, in order to give a special sense, this more for the private and this more for the public, the collective, what is bigger than every day and grander, which transcends individual and interest and purposes. Now, clearly traditional buildings, traditional cities are built that way, that you have a lot of vernacular, making the streets and squares being used for everyday purposes, for work, the economy, the commerce, and then symbolic buildings of the community, of whether it's civic or religious, which form the classical architecture, the marriage of these two, which I think form the most powerful and mature urban ensembles. I'm now going through some illustrations which make this very clear, because it's for everyday use, it's for everyone. This is not a sophisticated construction, it's extremely rudimentary. It's not high-tech, and it's easily understandable. When you look at traditional cities, whether it's Williamsburg or Paris, you generally have the tourist maps. They illustrate the vernacular by a simple imprint, not a two-dimensional imprint of a plan, because that is what interests the private realm, whereas the public buildings, the churches, the museum, and so on, are often illustrated in 3 dimensions. And this is really the subject of architecture, and that is the subject of vernacular. Very simple, easy to understand. But these categories have been completely overhauled, or so to speak, overhauled, but I don't think delegitimized by modernism, which claimed that because there are new conditions of industrial production, of synthetic materials, we must adopt these new materials in order to create an architecture of our time. Architecture should not be of our time. It should transcend our time, because it has to be for use to many, many generations and not just for the next ones. So we go here from vernacular, completely 100% vernacular constructions, like animal architecture, to 110% classicism, which was the Chicago World Fair. You know, all these illustrations of fantastic, unbelievable, delirious classicism, briefly constructed in the White City in Chicago by the greatest architects of the time. But they were also a declaration of war against the Victorian confusion. It was really a statement of high classicism, but to such a degree that it was very difficult to sustain at that level of quality for more than, let's say, 1.5 generations. It ended all with the First World War, and then there were some survivors, but Second World War completely legitimized the system. Now, I think, how much classicism or vernacular do you need for happiness? When you look at the best cities in the world, I would say, I find the best city in this country is Williamsburg. Don't know whether you visited, but as a model town, as the best balance between architecture and vernacular. And obviously in Europe it may be Venice or Rothenburg in Germany, and where you have often the good city is basically, like a good cake. It's a lot of dough and then some fruits which make it really interesting. Because this leads inevitably to digestive problems, not only of your physiological reality, but even of your spiritual mind. And people go, you can't sustain this kind of excellence over a long period of time. Now, when you look at these conditions, you find the same in music, that you find the same in painting or in agriculture, in gardening. This contrast of vernacular and classicism is a constant with anything worth talking about. And of course, as we are no longer used to it, as we went through 200 years of power hubris, I don't know, what petrol, the extraordinary powers we gained through the use of coal and petrol has also made us drunk in the spiritual sense. James Kunstler says that we are literally drunk on fossil fuel. We are so powerful, we can do so many things that our mind is not able to control these kind of things. So when you start now doing again classicism, of course you can't get this right straight away. But it's a fact that if this would be the traditional condition where vernacular is relatively small buildings, functional buildings for agriculture or for production, and the temples or the grander symbolic buildings for the republic or for the aristocracy or whoever reigns is not only larger, but because it's larger, it needs an art in order not to be crude. Because if you inverse the system, if the class becomes small, it becomes midget, it becomes a mini golf type decoration. It becomes mean, and this becomes gross. So it's very important that these two scale differences are also treated, size differences are treated in a very different manner and distinguishing manner. Now, you now see these enormous hotels, often in the Alps, where you have cottage, palace size, cottage style, or you have palaces cottage size, whereas there's a reason why palaces should be grand and cottages should be modest. I lived for a long time in this small town, which is very picturesque, but there's almost no architecture. There's just a few columns in the church, and the rest is just walls and tiles and a bit of decoration, and it's an absolute paradise, an architecture and urban paradise. So I think that is the ideal condition, where you have a lot of vernacular, and then some buildings are distinguishing. When you have small ensembles, you can virtually do without architecture. Villages can be without architecture, without becoming boring, because you have mountains or trees or something which really establishes beauty amongst these very modern, extreme, great beauty, sublime beauty amongst modest amounts of buildings. When you have large cities, you need something more of art in order to make it bearable. And this led to the extraordinary excess which we had either in Chicago, or which was common with Victorian building, where everything, even the teapot, was a masterwork. And we now fall back with laughter. But these people took it extremely seriously, because without a teapot like that, people would have been unhappy. Everything had to be decorated and so on. Curtains everywhere, and we suffocate in it. So it's very, one has to see what is actually the ideal balance, which not make architecture so important that it will be rejected or become a subject for revolution. Now let's see, what are these extremes? You all know St. Patrick's in Fifth Avenue, and this very painful feeling to have this rather grand cathedral in the shade of these rather bland and poor buildings, which I call private imperialism. Obviously, the over-dominance of the private over the public. And then you have these, let's say, Soviet or Nazi classism, which has these enormous monuments where everything is public and you have no more public, actually, public imperialism. Or that was the Lenin Soviet Congress palace with Lenin 400 meters high, like the World Trade Center. And whereas the ideal is a mix of these scales, not too much, not too little, but just enough to be happy. Now, the interesting thing comes when you mix vernacular architecture and classical architecture with classical or vernacular urbanism. You would have here clearly the center of Pensacola is a Euclidean grid. You know, it's a gridiron plan with very rigorous straight lines meeting at on crossings and forming relatively square blocks. For these kind of geometry, of urban geometry, you need a very special architecture, which is vernacular wouldn't be enough to make it bearable. Because when vernacular is so exposed on straight lines, it becomes extremely boring. No. And because you see everything at once, and you see often the poverty. Whereas when you have a very picturesque town plan, purely with vernacular, can often be charming. Because there are so many picturesque views, and you never see to the end of one street, and it's a very rich experience. I identified, mixing these two, urbanism and architecture, and then vernacular and classical, what is it? Classical or vernacular, and then you mix these with vernacular urbanism, classical urbanism, vernacular and classical mixture. And these are 9 categories in which you can mix these 4 or 6 elements. And it's very interesting when you travel around the world, in whatever region you are, you can always fit whatever you see, whatever urban experience, architectural experience you have, whether it's a building or an ensemble, you can fit them in one of these categories. And so it's not only an instrument for analyzing situations where you live in or which you visit, but particularly for planning. And so the question is, for planning new situations, the question is, what is the most appropriate for where, for what purposes, for what climate, for what geography? Now, for instance, I said, when you have this Euclidean, very rigid urban order, what is very inappropriate is to have vernacular architecture. It's what we call barracks architecture, because there's kind of rigidity to it, there's kind of uniformity to it. And it can be amusing when you have a great mixture of uses, but gets particularly unbearable when there's a single use occupying in that poor architecture this kind of very rigid geometry, whereas almost every other category can be extremely interesting. Now, there are some ground conditions how to make a city or what to avoid. And mixed use is an absolutely necessary condition. Mixed use, allowing any form of economy to allow activities within where a community lives for daily or weekly or even monthly uses, so you should be able to reach them without the use of artificial vehicles. And that is often a territory which would not be more than 70 or 80 acres, in which you should find your shops and your church and your school and your work, if possible. And it is now, except for some very large uses like airports or very large energy plants, or most production which is now performed in our countries can be fitted into office-type development. And actually the control of emissions in these factories is often more severe than the emissions which are produced by suburban homes. They're often extremely toxic, the suburban homes, as far as chemistry goes and as far as music goes and as far as noises go, much more noisy than most factories. And so interesting to see that here this high-tech development is all done in rather modest spaces. And we went to see this laboratory where they built this most refined of of robots. It's all done in an environment which can be next to homes because they don't produce very noisy conditions. So mixed use is foundational. It's absolutely important, but it's not sufficient, because if you put the mixed use all in one large landliner, as I call it, it's not a city. It's just a building with many uses, but it's not a city. A city needs to be done of separate buildings, of separate uses, and mixed in such a way that they make really a good streetscape and a good townscape and a good location of public buildings and private buildings. So I think this is a kind of ideal where you have a mix of functions, symbols, and destinations which, through their architectural expression, make a language which is readable, evident to everybody. You don't have to explain it. Throughout the 19th century, there were, for cities like Paris, there were extremely rigorous controls, for instance, of cornice lines, that you had to build to a certain building height, and you could not exceed it for residential buildings, almost for anything. And I think this leads to an artificial kind of boredom. So you can have the most diverse, you can have the temple, the public offices, private apartments, commercial buildings, industrial buildings, all to the same building height, and you put a cross on the roof just to signify that it's a church. That's not enough to make a nice city. This is overordained bureaucratic boredom, bureaucracy-induced boredom. Another situation which I think should be avoided is mixed use in completely wild, anarchic, disordered. The temple is just a little doghouse and the condo goes anywhere. I mean, the grumpy old man would protest. This is our reality most of the time. But I think this is the ideal to achieve, and I think seaside comes very close to it. It will take a lot of time to realize that, but 20, 30 years. And finally, Robert is tuning this every day. This is right, this is wrong, and this is appropriate, this is not appropriate. And with very large, except for some protesters, very large agreement of those who live there and the people who choose to go there, and it's an enormous success now with young people. It's a language which works. Everyone understands it. Goddamn, it works. We saw yesterday the 1,000 youth assembling on the beach, and they were standing around like it was very funny. But seaside was meant to be for old people. Now has become trend, because it is a language which is universal, I think, to humans. Now, for instance, large ensembles, like a monastery or a university, or often when you identify the parts which are public, which are architecture, and those which are more private or less without rhetorics, let's say, that this would be the correct reading. You read this is obviously for use which are for individuals, and that's for the collective. If you have the same mix of use misapplied, architecture, you have suddenly the modest part becomes monumental, and the chapel is just reduced to a doghouse and so on. You see what I mean? It's a very interesting instrument to read, and then also when all this becomes architecture, when every small corner and even the toilets are decorated, becomes terribly boring, and finally the language will die. Now, if we go over to urbanism to see what happens to us, this kind of hubris of scale, of sprawl, and I call this vertical sprawl, because this is horizontal cul-de-sacs plugged onto a national grid where inevitably it causes geographic congestion, and this is vertical cul-de-sacs, only one way in and out, or two, but always congesting where it's plugged into the regional or national grid. And I think it's really these things which should be avoided. There's enough propaganda about it, and we choose to promote actually the opposite model, because this has enough. This is what is taught in architectural schools, this is taught in planning schools, and it's a system which doesn't need any ideological defense. It's there whether we like it or not. whereas the traditional model needs a lot of articulation. There are only 2 schools in this country which teach it, and in Europe there is not even one. Now, and very few of the planners and architects are actually conscious that they are building into the wrong type of building, with the wrong type of materials, in the wrong location, in the wrong climate. Everything is wrong. What we do with enormous effort and colossal amounts of energies. We are really wasting an incredible occasion to do good cities. But I think the wheel is turning, and there's now a lot of people conscious of it, that we are doing something wrong, and then what to do, how to put it right is not an easy job. But basically, we have been repeating the skyscraper type, the suburban home, and then the land scraper, ground scraper, in very large quantities, in monofunctional zones, by excessive amount of the same use. And this kind of zoning has now shaped the economy, it has shaped the mentalities, it has shaped society, and to build an alternative model takes a lifetime, like Robert took to build Seaside, which does not respond to any of these types, but really makes mixed use and mixed symbols, which make a meaningful language which will survive us all, I think. So traditional building is mature, to build to mature size and the mature shape, and then multiply, go over to build another town, Neustadt, Villeneuve, in all the languages. You have these concepts, whereas the last 100 years have been vertical overexpansion and horizontal overexpansion due to excessive disponibility of fossil fuel. Now, when you look at the property sizes, like traditional towns throughout ages, whether it's Roman or medieval or classical, were made in proximity of a very large difference of plots, sizes, and character and use, large, medium, and small, which would form an urban neighborhood around finely shaped squares and streets and alleyways, and mixing often income and races and whatever in the ideal situation. Well, let's say it's not dream, but it is the instrument which transcends political differences and allows to build the civitas, the public space where the differences of economy, of race, of beliefs are actually have an instrument where to meet in a common space where there is a natural place to meet and live their rivalries in a civilized manner. Urbanité in French means urbanness, means good manners. And that is what urban shaping is about. You have then, throughout the last 3-4 centuries, an extraordinary growth in scale of building lots, and finally in totalitarian states, or now in very large sort of modern developments, you have the enormous building lots for single use, which are often the size of 2-3 traditional towns. And of course, when you are an architect and you get to build in such an area 1 million square feet for a university, what do as one single architect? You get bored and you draw the same, you draw 5 windows and you repeat them ever so often. So it's preordained boredom, architectural boredom. What happens if you are bored? You go nuts. You become Frank Gehry. You can't stand it anymore, and you make crazy buildings, which are supposed to be interesting. But they should be interesting because of their use, and that the forms generate different forms which create language. Imagine now a whole town designed like Frank Gehry was really mostly influenced by Finsterlin, who was a crazy German expressionist in 1920, who drew cities and mountains, and they all were crazy. I mean, they sometimes form interesting buildings, but you cannot conceive of an entire village, an entire town, an entire region, an entire country, a state, a country, a planet built that way. It's impossible. It's just done possible because you can explode budget beyond anything which is sensate. And so it's certainly not a model to admire, because it's already admired enough. I mean, you can find it amusing, but it's certainly not a way to build cities. And now you find this incredible excess of scale throughout the last 200 years. These are traditional towns, whether it's Paris or Brive, or Roman town in Africa and so on. They had human scale. And I don't speak about human scale as something sentimental. It's human, like our trousers are human, because they adapted for our body. It's a matter of dimensions, which is comfortable and can produce good forms. Throughout the 19th century and then 20th century, totalitarian models or socialist models or Corbusier's final mad city of 3 million people, where everything is completely disembodied and torn apart by mechanical systems of transport and communication and so on. So what we are talking about is that we have the pedestrian city. We use vehicles, but in a modest sense, when it's necessary, not because we are forced to every day. So it's that we have to limit urban quarters or urban neighborhoods or traditional neighborhoods, as they are called here, to about 70 acres, 30 hectares, horizontally and vertically to 3 to 5 stories, because that's what you can walk as a sane person 20 times a day. And it's very good for exercise, 100 steps. If I could make one law, I would make a law that thou shalt not build higher than 3 floors. Nowhere. And if it's a general condition, societies will adapt to it. That's what cities were like. And the economy, will be shaped according to it. When you impose 3 floors, you will end up with 5. No, because you just can't stop it. But this is complete madness. This is with the first major crisis which will hit us within our lifetime. This system will collapse in a dramatic, catastrophic, and absolutely unforeseeable ways. And these are presidential issues, which it's not just architects for fun. No. So it's really the choice between suburban promotion of sprawl or promotion of community-sized cities. So that's the model of the last 200 years, that the small town grows bigger, 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 and forms this enormous sprawl, leading to excess amount of daily transport inside, outside. Guatemala City has now every day 2 million people traveling into and out of this small historic center. And everybody goes mad, sitting for 3-4 hours in polluting congestion. So whereas the model of the future must be that the large metropolis is a family of small cities with a reduced amount of mechanical transport, or a very large commonwealth of small cities spread according to geography and natural resources. I mean, this is a model of the future, but it will take generations to get there. And that's really biomorphic, trying to imitate nature in that healthy growth is always the multiplications of cells, whereas one of the definitions of sickness is the excessive growth of single cells, destroying the carrying system. Now, families grow by multiplication. This is as if families would grow by hypertrophy of the parent bodies. It's a tragic joke, calling home. I will now illustrate this with some project. This is the town for the Prince of Wales. We have now built these 2 quarters, and we are starting this one. Polycentric, instead of single center as this town was, we are going towards a polycentric situation. That was the first phase. Not medieval. It's vernacular geometry with very modest architecture, central square and radiating streets. And you don't get the whole picture. That was meant to be a church, but it became an office block because there are already too many churches in town. But anyway, you can't get everything. But the picture is right. Now, why do polycentric city with modest heights? Because this excessive concentration of uses on a single plot creates not only monofunctional boredom and but creates enormous social divisions, excessive real estate values in the center, and then a spread outwards. And the division is also a zoning of societies. For instance, in Colombia, all the rich live in tower blocks, and the poor live in slums up the hills. And they don't meet. There's no space for them to meet. So I think we are Christian societies. I'm not a practicing Christian, but the civitas, the Christian model of society, is fantastic, and I think transcends any metaphysical belief or transcendental beliefs. And it's, I think, that model which we have to return to. So that the size and the verticality or horizontality, decor or lack of decor, make a language we understand. I don't have to explain to you. No. This is evident to everyone. That's for the town of, that's what we planned. The press said it is impossible. The Prince of Wales gone mad. I mean, no, he's an idiot. And this is what is built. And people who visit that, they think it's historic. It's modern. It's 20 years old. These are new, and we now finally, after 20 years of training craftsmen, we get very good quality of building. They're as good as any Georgian building, sometimes better. And we have great architects doing this. And we have, above all now, New Orleans type, as you have also here, so, because they're extremely cheap to build, these balconies. And so on. That's the future Queen Mother Square, which will be opened by the Queen next year. So we limit building height not to a metric height, which leads to architectural repetitiveness, and also compels builders to build as many low floors as possible in this limiting envelope. Whereas when you say 3-floor height limit or 5-floor height limit or 1-floor height limit, you can have a great variety of building heights. According to the campanile of the famous campanile of Giotto in Florence, is 5-story high building, but 100 meters high, 300 feet high. And here you have it. The Eiffel Tower is a 3-story high skyscraper. No, 1, 2, 3. The Capitol building in Washington is a 1-story high skyscraper. It dominates not only Washington, it dominates American politics. What would Washington be without that building? Just a single-story high building, and so on. So in a way, the meaningfulness or the monumental potency of a building augments as you reduce the number of floors in relationship to the volumetric expression. Now, when you build a traditional town, it becomes such a machine for improving real estate values, for improving social values, for creating civitas, that you have to protect it against speculative and hostile takeovers. And the skyscraper is a hostile takeover and destruction of value. Now, it can make a lot of money for a single individual, but if you go to the bitter logic of this skyscraping madness, imagine every single building lot built as a skyscraper. There can be no nightmare more unbearable than this. No. And it will be nice to be on top, but it gets hell the more you go down to the street level. One of the reasons why we have not only relatively small buildings, or buildings never larger than they need to be typologically, no, is to employ very small builders rather than hand it out to national house builders. Small builders are extremely, and it was a policy which was worth it. All these builders we employed started with 5 to 10, sometimes 15 employees. They have now become major builders over 20 years. But is to bring back traditional forms of building with natural local materials and training crafts on site, as also I think Seaside has been unbelievably powerful regionally to change the quality of the vernacular, not just in Seaside, but around the whole province, around the whole state. And sometimes there are imitations of Seaside which should get the Seaside Prize, actually. They're incredibly good, no. Particularly when you drive past them. Probably when you study the detail, you could actually improve them. But it's to bring back a small-scale enterprise and investment, which has been completely wiped out by a larger and larger, by zoning land with enormous lots where you can only develop with very large investments. This is a project in Guatemala City where a very large family, which this is the center of Guatemala City, and these are the properties of the Leal family. It's over several kilometers long, and we are building this, is now finished. We are just nearly finished. We planned now these two. And they are linked by a high street, linking them all up with the university, a Jesuit university at the center, and so on. All this is built in concrete, no way to avoid it. 20 years ago I would have resigned, but no, concrete is very good material if you use it in the proper way. And also because there are such stringent anti-seismic laws that there's no way you can build in traditional ways here. But all this building has been built in the last 5 years. So you don't need 1,000 years to build a real attractive urban piece of land. This was supposed to be a restaurant. It was a temporary church. And after 50 years of abstinence, I even was taken by my architects there to have communion. So, never too late. Or you have this very fine craftsmanship being developed for. We avoid artwork like hell. No art in our cities, because when art is so bad, we don't need art. We have good buildings and some fountains. But it will come back, because all this training of crafts also trains talents which are naturally born. And the traditional crafts of building, there are 39 different crafts of building. When you have young people, they find their ways into these crafts, you find all these vocations are suddenly coming back. There's vocations which were supposed to be dead and matter of the past. And you find good work, people who are apt to do good woodwork or good iron work or good masonry. The traditional building, many people, modernist artists think this is too simple a thing. A house is not just windows and doors and roofs, but that is all a house is about. This is very sophisticated. Artifice, it's not natural. Nothing like that exists in nature. It's an analogical imitation of nature. There are apertures and closures and protection and so on. But in order to protect an artifice against erosion that you have a roof, it's not a matter of style. And reinventing the house is not only useless, but a ridiculous exercise which will be very quickly forgotten. What we have to struggle with is fakeness, that most of building now, which looks traditional, is in fact fake. Doesn't stand up to inspection. No. And that is what we have to struggle with, and why universities should at least have one faculty teaching traditional crafts and traditional construction and language. This is a very large building complex I did with my brother in Luxembourg. My brother proposed a big palace for justice, and I proposed a little city which was finally built. And where each different branch of the judicial system occupies one, the High Court or the youth tribunal or collective services library and so on. They form like a small town built on this rock in Luxembourg City. I gave up after 7 years of struggling with the Luxembourg bureaucracy. My brother went on for another 7 years to build it, and it became an object of hatred for architects. So much so that it polluted the media in such a way that my sister was stopped in the street by a friend who said, "Marianne, tell me, why can't your brothers be modern?" The person has nothing to do with architecture. But the media, that in fact it's very pleasant, it fits very well into the historic townscape of Luxembourg. And there's a big project for the mayor of Rome, who is now has been voted out, but was to reform a very large 29,000 inhabitants slum outside Rome, unspeakable ugliness. But the mayor of Rome then, he said, we have to reconstruct the metropolis in a polycentric fashion, adopting this political or meta-political aspect of planning to rebuild communities so that you do not have a single center and the suburbs, but that Rome again becomes a polycentric situation, because he had done a study how much different classes of Roman citizens spent in time and money and energy on traveling to and from their work. And this is absolutely catastrophic for the lower income classes. It's unsustainable over a long period of time. But he lost the elections, and no, he's now investigated by the mafia. Because there are two mafias in Rome, not just one. And it's to transform a suburb of cul-de-sacs, of geographic cul-de-sacs, over 25 years into a metropolis of each independent quarter. And this was the first phase. The transforming these arboreal cul-de-sacs. 29,000 people live there. This would become a town of 44,000 people, of 4 different quarters, and basically done by the private industry. And this surplus, which would then help to rebuild this slum, 18 towers would come down and 60 slabs. This one is holy ground, we couldn't touch it. And that's the view, there is the holy ground. And this is this new quarter. And I adopted, and all these small blocks is what the Roman middle classes live in very pleasantly in the Parioli or Quartiere Triumphale, and which has never been used for social housing. It's a palazzina, a small palace, about 60 by 65 or 70 feet, with parking under it and lots of views around, so forming a dense urban pattern. And that's what it looked like. This was presented to an audience of over 3,000 people, extremely hostile, developers, intellectuals. The university organized a seminar against it to save this slum because it's considered as historic. No, it was all built in 3 years and it's leaking like sieves, and the Comune can no longer pay for the maintenance. So that's the traffic hierarchy, very fast traffic outside, and then very slow, 10 to 15 kilometers inside. And this is the aspects of. And then, of course, lots of private and public uses mixed with schools and a town hall, a public square, major public square, a market building, fountains. Everything which is nice in the center of Rome would be also exported into the suburbs. The residential blocks, they have always very large, there are 4 flats per floor with very large loggia on the corner with balconies. And that's your balcony. Social housing, s'il vous plaît. And of course you would have, this would attract probably also tourism and hotels, public buildings, market building. Not a church designed according to the Vatican II principles that there must be no symmetry. No. Sacred geometry has to begin to dance. And every one of these palazzine has then also a penthouse, which is the most agreeable form of urban living. Now, not a single image of these renderings was published in Italy. I used to be one of the most published architects in Italy for like 30 years. Not one of these images was published in one single professional paper. So I believe in conspiracy now. Thank you. I was asked if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. Recently, a group of psychologists on public radio mentioned that social media had just caused the narcissism rate among Americans, or just really the world, really just to skyrocket. Is there any relationship between narcissism and toxic architecture?
I think we are all narcissistic. Huh? We have to be in order to. to live. But there are forms of narcissism which are really dangerous, and particularly when they produce environments which cannot survive for a long period of time, or where you cannot imagine what will it be if this goes on for many generations. I think artists, I mean, not only artists, but everybody is narcissistic, and everybody has a right to be happy with himself and to look at his navel and be happy, because otherwise you get depressed. But I think the traditional crafts and talents, and whether it's music or literature or economics or whatever we are good at, when we find the right métier to exercise, we can exercise our narcissism in a productive and pleasant and poetical way, which is of public good, instead of becoming poisoning the water and becoming criminal sometimes. And I think the town plan is as important as law, as common law. It's part of common law, so that we can behave in a good manner without being forced to it, but because it's much better. There's actually advantages. But now when you have people being asked to build a 900-meter high skyscraper in the middle of Paris, who do you think would refuse? If you appoint an architect designed by the President of France, nobody would refuse, even though he knows full well that it's going to destroy Paris. So common law, this kind of principle which is governed by moral law, should become also a geometric law, that according to Kant's imperative, that you should act in such a way that the principle of your action can become a principle of common law. If you apply that to architecture, you get seaside, or Poundbury, or traditional towns. Yes,
do you have any good examples of good American subsidized public housing in the architecture vein?
Well, there is, of course, there is HUD. I have not seen good examples, but I hear that there are good examples. The problem is often that the programming of HUD is very monofunctional. You get, I think, 1,000 houses to build somewhere in district, and 1,000 houses without anything else is, I think, an error. So I think those programs should be really be much more complex. And if you can't plan, for instance, many of the public buildings or those uses which should come later when the community is established cannot be the burden of a single developer. Because the private developer cannot possibly build a public town. I mean, the seaside is a completely exceptional and heroic piece of work, because he followed really, Davis followed certain principles which should be really principles of public authorities. But you can't build it all at once, because you can't build a public building if there's no public. Once the city is there, of course there will be demand. So my technique of doing it is that if you build, even if you have a monofunctional program, you should build it in such a way that you maintain certain lots within the town, which will be, once the community is established, will be able to respond to a public necessity for a school or for, I don't know, shops or whatever is not in your program. But that's very difficult to convince a private developer of.
We have time for two more succinct questions.
40 years ago,
Robert wanted to say something.
40 years ago, shortly after he became mayor, Joe Riley stopped the public housing program and went to Washington and renegotiated with HUD to invest the money in scattered site Charleston single houses. And that then got revisited about 15 years later as a Hope 6 program, which did create quite a few mixed use and mixed income communities. None as good as Charleston, of course, but it still is a program that had quite a bit of success in various communities. Norfolk, Virginia has one of the earliest and best.
Well, I think we are in this.
It's probably the best example.
We have
it's not here,
35% of social housing, which is imposed by regional government. But I think it's very dangerous because it's very artificial. Why should but the way we do it, we pepper pot the sites, so it does not create a zone of low income. They are just amongst other houses, but often the money which goes into building these houses is sometimes more actually than private terms. There's a lot of money in public housing still in England, despite Margaret Thatcher trying to reduce it. So it is the man back there.
I was hoping you would speak to trees and greenery in the urban landscape.
Well, you know that was a joke, of course. Now, the sense of humor of the Prince of Wales is very misunderstood by English media, who like to denigrate, because they are against royalty. Everything the prince does must, of course, be that of an idiot. And the more he acts intelligently, his demonstration that there may be actually legitimacy for royalty, so which drives them nuts, the Republicans. In England, the anti-royalists are called the Republicans. But I think that he has actually found a role for which, a legitimacy which had been completely lost for royalty, I think.
One more question.
Right here. Behind you.
In the polycentric model, where do the arts congregate?
The what?
The polycentric model, I mean, the arts congregate in New York. Where would the arts congregate in a polycentric model?
They don't congregate. I mean, we don't want excessive congregation.
But with arts, you want all your, I mean, we go to New York to see shows because that's where all the talent is. How does that work?
Well, that is a personal opinion, I would say. I mean, I find art so bad that I followed the advice of a young assistant who said we should form a society for an art-free society.
On that happy note, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.